These timed diversions force you to take out a group of mutated rabbits, with one helix granted for entering the bonus area and another for successfully clearing it within a time limit. Again, miss one, and you have to go back. Along with purposefully going off the beaten path into incredible danger to find those in plain sight, this ultimately turns what would have been a cartoonishly morbid action-adventure game into a dull slog. The intended way to finish the game is far less enjoyable than quickly rushing through it. Your puddle of ooze is also incredibly fragile. While you can lose a substantial amount of mass and still slide around, a single blow to Caine's head from any source of damage will instantly kill him. Now, maybe this is the wrong impression to have, but in a game where you're incentivized to collect as much mass as possible and become an unstoppable force of destruction, why is this immediately made worthless by taking a single errant blow? It'd be like if the monster from the blob could be killed by throwing a salt shaker at it. The only benefit of growing larger is having a slightly easier time fighting things, but you'll just as quickly lose this mass through tiny mistakes or environmental hazards that can't be avoided at a certain size. The first level, the toxic dump, sets up a bizarre expectation for the rest of the game where you are rarely, if ever, hampered by environmental hazards or tight hallways. There's a momentum to be found in your movements and actions, and that almost immediately vanishes in favor of stop-and-go progression and dangerous beelines away from obstacles as soon as the first boss is defeated. It feels more in line with what would be expected from a stealth game, but you're often discouraged from directly circumventing enemies. The genetics lab, found a little over halfway through the ooze, feels like an encapsulation of just about everything that's wrong with the adventure as a whole. One level starts with a precarious scenario. Shortly after beginning the level, you're greeted with an obstacle, a pair of pits with a glowing pole between them. It's established early on that these poles can be clung to with your melee attack to pull your body between narrow gaps since it stretches your mass far enough to form a thin line. It's a novel idea for traversing obstacles, and it's fun to use when it works. However, if you enter the level with an insufficient amount of mass to clear the distance, you will immediately die. A similar issue presents itself later, where if you have a significant amount of mass, surrounding pits and floor gates will immediately drain a significant amount of it away. Other times, your movement speed is too slow to pass through hazards, with one egregious example guaranteeing your death unless you find a power-up that is completely obscured by an obfuscating wall. What initially starts out as a promising adventure slowly devolves into something brutally difficult, with an unfortunate amount of frustration littered throughout. What could have been an incredible power fantasy is actually an incredibly difficult game whose content doesn't justify the immense time investment it ultimately demands. The toxic dump was fun, for what it's worth. Was the ooze successful, at least? STI had previously taken the world by storm with their efforts on Sonic the Hedgehog 2 and both Sonic 3 and Sonic and Knuckles. Even the critically maligned Sonic Spinball kept the studio afloat with its modest sales numbers. Did the ooze see a similar financial return? The short answer is no. The long answer needs a bit more context. You see, 1995 was a groundbreaking year for not just Sega but for the medium of gaming as a whole. It would be the year that the Nintendo Entertainment System, NES, the Genesis' first major competitor, would officially be discontinued. The SNES would be the single best-selling console in both the United States and Japan. The latter half of the year would see Sony's foray into the home console market with their signature PlayStation, beating Nintendo to the punch by almost a year when it came to 3D graphics and disc-based storage. Sega themselves were busy with their own disc-based system, the Sega Saturn. You could argue that the Saturn would ultimately be one of the biggest contributors to STI's eventual shuttering. There were a lot of moving pieces at play when it came to the Saturn, so we'll boil it down to a few key points. The difficulty in developing for the Saturn, combined with the intense competition in the console market, the departure of multiple key staff members, and a failure to ultimately provide a new Sonic game, Sonic X-treme, ultimately left STI as a shell of its former self. The studio would be officially dissolved and repurposed into a product department towards the end of 1996. Did the ooze leave any meaningful impact on the gaming industry as a whole? Interestingly enough, yes. A designer for the ooze, Stieg Hedlund, would have tremendous success in the industry following his stint with STI. He would later join Condor as a lead designer, whose work in the action RPG genre would lead to one of the most famous games in the genre to this day. Did we say Condor? Sorry, we meant Blizzard North, the same studio responsible for Diablo and StarCraft, which he had an extensive role in developing. Multiple artists, including art director Bob Steele and artist Alan Ackerman, would join Headland for Diablo 2. Producer Michael Wallace would be involved with Blade and Soul and EVE Online, and Craig Stitt would play a role in the development of just about every PS2-era Ratchet & Clank game. There was clearly plenty of talent involved with both the Ooze and STI as a whole, and that talent translated into quality products later on. Funnily enough, you can even find traces of what the Ooze attempted to accomplish in the decades that followed. The best example would likely be 2020's Caine, developed by Phobia Game Studio and published by Devolver Digital. Though it feels less like an unofficial Toxic Avenger game and more like a horrifying riff on Alien, a similarly unusual control scheme is utilized to bring a tentacle-driven creature to life. Games that are similar in spirit, like Maneater, Jaws, Unleashed, Prototype, and The Darkness, would also recapture the lofty promise of playing as a horrifying monster with unconventional powers. Is the Ooze worth playing nowadays? Probably not. The aforementioned titles do ultimately recreate a similar premise found in the Ooze, with each one featuring its own modern conveniences, like the ability to stop playing and save your progress. That being said, it's worth at least taking a look at whenever you find a chance. It remains a forgotten oddity from later in the Genesis life, one of the last few projects to linger on in the era of 2D games. The Ooze is available exclusively on the Sega Genesis, though it has seen numerous re-releases either on plug-and-play consoles or the Sonic Mega Collection released in 2002. The Ooze is certainly an interesting game, at least on a conceptual level. The story of the game is that you play as a scientist who is turned into ooze by the evil corporation he works for, and he is on a mission of revenge to take down their toxic organization and regain his humanity. The interesting concept comes from how you play as this ooze, as you take the form of essentially a giant moving puddle with a skull at the center. As the ooze, you move through various grimy and toxic locales on your trip to take down your boss, only able to attack by way of extending your form in a sort of punch or spitting a glob of goo at an enemy from afar. You can pick up ooze to grow bigger as you play, but you can lose it to various hazards and enemy attacks, so you're always shifting in size as you progress. Now, this idea has a lot of interesting potential applications, and could make for a very unique game. Unfortunately, the ooze comes and hits you with an intriguing concept and then has no idea how to execute it. Right off the bat, the game shows you it did not design levels with the ooze in mind. The world is incredibly difficult to navigate and requires a lot of finicky tricks to get past areas where you're almost guaranteed to lose some of your mass. You will only die if your skull gets hit by an enemy attack or you run too low on mass, and the game absolutely relishes any chance to take your mass away. Enemies are ruthless, some firing weapons that fire straight through you and can sever off a huge chunk of your mass no sweat. And while you can try to strike them from afar, enemies are often hidden around corners you have to take or down obnoxiously small hallways. If you had more control of your mass, perhaps this wouldn't be so bad, but you actually control the skull and the slime just follows it. Speaking of those hallways, almost every level is poorly designed for what should be the main appeal of this game. As the ooze, it is very satisfying to grow into an enormous green puddle of angry former scientist, but the game takes every opportunity to rob you of mass or give you areas that compress you into very narrow paths. Those narrow paths are often setups for some sort of enemy attack or trap that will cut you down to size, so losing mass is essentially unavoidable. The game shrinking you down makes sense in a way as a means to make certain areas more difficult, and it could work as a punishment for being brazen and brash, but it feels more like this is a constant punishment for daring to play the game at all. The ooze is similar to the mysterious Murasame Castle in that it is hard for all the wrong reasons. Besides the previously mentioned problems, the ooze's controls are not very intuitive, even when giving the allowances for the strange character you're controlling. Punches can be angled around corners, but it's difficult to do what you're trying to do consistently, and movement in general seems to follow no consistent rule on how your slime will behave. You will adjust to it, but the game does not wait to throw you in the deep end. Enemies are everywhere and are sometimes hidden, requiring you to potentially check every area you go into carefully to avoid a cheap death and thus slowing down the game's pace incredibly. There are also obstacles you can't see, such as hidden drains, except sometimes, hidden drains are placed along the way onward. The game also makes it incredibly oblique to figure out what you're supposed to do. To progress, especially in the later levels, requires blind luck when it comes to which walls you press up against and finding out which switches to flip to deactivate one of tens of barriers in an area. The levels are almost universally designed to make navigation overcomplicated, and figuring out how to go on will never make you feel clever, since it usually just involves ramming yourself against potential danger in the hopes you actually selected the right obscure area to progress. Surprisingly, the only levels that really seemed to understand how to utilize the ooze were in the last zone of the game. Somehow, while the front of the game is frustratingly difficult and poorly designed, they whip out a simple area with reasonable challenge and appropriate punishments right before the end. I would joke they made you play the game in reverse, but the game had only been throwing more and more bad design at you until suddenly it gives you what should have been the design philosophy behind all the levels. Earlier I mentioned that the goal of the game is to restore your humanity, but that's only possible if you find a bunch of DNA orbs hidden throughout the levels. The game puts some in sight, but the majority of them are squared away in places just as obscure as the ways onward. Randomly pressing yourself into a corner can take you to a mini-game to get one of the orbs, but if you fail, you're out of luck. Even trying to find them actively can lead to you coming up far short of the 50 you need to locate, and it turns out the reward for getting them all is essentially one extra image during the ending. The bosses are no better than the levels. Many of them require way too much damage to kill. You get very little indication of your progress on a boss, and many will drain your mass so quickly that you have to step away and repeatedly kill slowly spawning enemies for more ooze before you can step back in and land a few more strikes. Again, the final area surprised me, as the final boss seemed a more reasonable fight than all the others. Surprisingly, despite its unfair difficulty and tedious nature, this game has earned quite a bit of love online. I could hardly believe that people enjoyed this game that much, but as I investigated a bit deeper, I noticed a common thread. Most people seem to have never finished the game. They praise it while pointing out how hard it is, perhaps giving up when they hit roadblocks or from dying so easily and losing their progress. If I had to identify one reason why people seem so fond of this game, besides perhaps the fact people will look back fondly on a game of their youth regardless of quality, is the game's one major strength: the atmosphere. The ooze absolutely revels in the oppressive corporate toxicity of its setting. Everything is dully colored and looks grimy or coldly corporate. Enemies are bugs, gross monsters, and things that look like twisted humans or soulless machines. It's a hostile world, one poisoned so thoroughly by the corporation you're angling to take down that you wouldn't even need to watch the poorly conveyed and flickering opening cutscene to justify wanting to wipe them from the face of the planet. Again, we come back to how intriguing the concept is, how unique it is that you're playing as an ooze puddle, all sold beautifully by an environment that oozes its poisonous nature unapologetically. Ultimately though, it's hard to appreciate all this when the game itself is resisting your attempts to play it. I won't give a bad game a pass just because it has a nice coat of paint over it. However, I do think the ooze could be reimagined into a much more interesting and fun experience on modern hardware. I legitimately thought at times that the ooze might be so bad it would earn itself a disaster report. It's almost like those final levels were a desperate saving throw by the game to avoid an atrocious rating, as they helped show that for all its faults, it's a functional game that can have a few moments where you feel like you're maneuvering the ooze in an interesting way. Because of this, the ooze does not stand amongst the worst of the worst, but it is still needlessly difficult, poorly structured and designed, and does not make good use of its admittedly intriguing concept while also squandering a pretty decent tone and visual theme. And so, I give the ooze for the Sega Genesis/Mega Drive. If you liked it, don't forget to leave a like. It's a quick and simple way to show support. Share this video with friends, family, or anyone you think might be interested. Your help with publicity is essential for the growth of the channel. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any new content. Click the bell to receive notifications whenever we post something cool. I really appreciate your presence here. Your support makes all the difference. Continue following, sharing and leaving your comments. We are building an amazing community together. See you in the next video.